Okay, thanks. I thought it was good to have that exercise. I don't know about you, but usually mid-afternoon on a Saturday, I'm having a nap. But thank you all for being here instead. We are, I think, quite aware of the fact that we're now heading towards the end of the conference, and many of you, your thoughts might be turning to the evening's festivities. So we're going to try and keep this hopefully as light and as lively as we can. And obviously, we're here to talk about creativity, but really in an Asian context. And we're very lucky to be joined by two people who are, I think, leading a lot of the creative work that we're seeing coming out of various Asian markets. So this is your opportunity to ask them as many questions as you can or as you like. I'm going to make sure that we have enough time for questions this time. But in particular, we want to focus on this idea that creativity is not this kind of, global edict that's handed down from an ivory tower in Cannes or an awards jury that's sitting in a room somewhere else in the world. I think we can all agree that creativity is really, for all of us, it's a means by which we are trying to accomplish certain goals, whether that's changing people's minds, changing people's behavior. And if we think of creativity in that way, then it becomes really clear, I think, that without understanding the context in which decisions are made, creativity itself becomes worthless. And that becomes even more important, I think, in a region like Asia, where every context, every country, and every market is so different. And creativity becomes a local phenomenon rather than a regional construct or even a global idea. And I'm sure many of you will have had experience of this. Perhaps you have, I don't know if there's still any global agency heads in the room, probably one or two, where you're asked to execute the global campaign, maybe here in India or maybe in another market, and perhaps you think it just doesn't work. So we're here to try and talk about that, try and illuminate how we can get to a point where the creative work is successful because of the context, because of the local market conditions, rather than in spite of them. And to start that off, I thought, and to give you something relaxing to do, we will show you some work that I think brings to life this idea that creativity in Asia requires that local resonance, that local understanding of local cultures. So I'm going to start with you, Darren. I think you have two campaigns you wanted to show. Are they both from China?
I hope so, yeah. I hope they're working.
Okay.
One is from Nike and one is from Kindle.
Okay. So we show, is it Nike first?
This is a bit old, but I think it's super relevant to localization.
I 觉得跑步这个东西很脏很闷。
觉得经过这3年耐克公关的努力，跑步在中国已经成了一个非常非常时髦的一件事。
Okay, so before we show the Kindle one, Darren, tell me why that campaign demonstrates what is unique, perhaps, about how creativity works in a Chinese context.
Right. I think it's how you almost, Fred talked about relevancy before, right? Relevatize a global brand, whether it's in India or whether it's in China, you need to really understand the local market very seriously. And so when Nike came to us years ago, I first moved to Shanghai 10 years ago, and we were trying to pitch running stories to journalists, right? And nobody gave a SHIT, right? People were like, why do I want to write about running stories? It has no relevance whatsoever to me in China. Nobody runs. you saw the video, old geezers in t-shirt run. It's boring, it's sweaty, it's individual, it's very American, doesn't make any sense. So what we really tried to do was really get influencers such as managing editors of magazines and lifestyle magazines to actually run in marathons and half marathons, right? And so once we did that, it totally transformed the way we delivered in China. And so influencer is at the core of everything we do today. And that's been happening for 10 years in China, so co-creation. The other thing was we made it visually appealing. So we actually went out and got local Chinese fashion photographers to take photos of running gear and people running in a really creative lifestyle way, right? Which really got a lot of cut through as well. So I think it's about having that relevancy for the local market that really gets to cut through. And I think if you talk about the relevance of PR today, that is old school PR that revolutionized the brand in a market, right? So we should be very proud of what we do in the PR industry. We can actually transform the brands through influencer engagement and through what we do really well. We're just earned at the core.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we've kind of jumped in here, I think, with the idea that public relations is able to lead creative. I don't think we need to belabor that point. I think people in this room are already, doing work that goes well beyond the kind of traditional media relations of years gone by. So the next campaign is?
The next campaign should be Kindle.
Kindle.
In love with reading.
So just a couple of words on this one and how you think, what it tells us.
I think, again, it's interesting because, Kindle obviously is well known in the US and many other places, but in China, people read off phones, right? So how to make Kindle really interesting. So what we use is a lot of data and look at discussions and try to find out what is it about reading in China. We find nobody really aggregated reading in China. So trying to use a lot of influencers to talk about why they read and how that ties to the national conversation was happening in China about reading. Because reading rates in China are actually falling, right? People read less, they watch more videos, and there's a whole discussion going on nationally about how that's making people more stupid, right? Not as smart, right? People who read are obviously more intelligent, right? Right? So it's how do you ignite those people that love reading and really ignite the influencer around that and really make it into a big campaign. So again, locally relevant in the zeitgeist at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Margaret, over to you. So I think we have, is it a Samsung campaign you wanted to show us?
Does anybody have a Samsung phone? Does anybody work for Samsung here? Somebody does?
Yep.
Okay, free PR for you. Okay.
세상에서 제일 사랑하는 엄마가 혜지, 엄마를 제일 사랑하는 예나, 세상에서 제일 누구보다 더 많이
don't know if you could read the titles, but so I'm from Korea, and we wanted to make sure that we had creative case studies that reflected the Asian market. As Arun said, the nuances and the cultural and the local relevance are so very different. And Samsung is considered the giant behemoth in Korea. But as Jennifer had given... Hello? Can you hear me now?
Well,
Probably too loud now. But as Jennifer's presentation, which was very great, was on purpose and functionality. And everybody that has a Samsung phone knows that it's very functional, but when you see this video, basically there's an insight there to create the creative idea. And the insight is that many children, autistic children, love digital devices. The problem is, as you saw, Jonghyun is the 11-year-old child, and he's truly autistic. Chael Worldwide is the advertising firm that created the video and this app. The UX designer is a friend of the mother. And so what she wanted to do is, they struggle with eye contact. So the idea was to create this app where you have 7 different games. They did clinical trials. They had doctors, academics, UX designers, and they've created this very functional, very purposeful, but fantastic app that can be used everywhere. So Canada has now launched it, and I heard most recently Bangladesh has also launched this app in India, in Bengali. Mm-hmm. And so I think, when the idea about Asia and creativity, when you look at the context of Asia, and you look at the population, and you look at the economies, and you look at the companies that are now going global within Asia, there is a real chance for us as communicators to do things differently than a press release or a brand celebrity, for instance. This is a time for us, in many ways, creativity is equated with creating some of the world's greatest problems. And I think that's the exciting opportunity for us. Beyond Cannes, I know you're going to ask about this, because everybody's talking about Cannes. I think really creativity is really diving down into an insight, a creative idea, and really thinking about how that amplifies in a way that resonates with consumers and populations, and really kind of fixing big problems, right? So that was a case study from Samsung.
yeah, great campaign. Great idea. So I'm going to show one, and it won't be, I don't actually think it'll be anything new to people in this room, because it's actually an Indian campaign. But I wanted to show it because I felt it really reflected the kind of work that I think would succeed in India, but maybe might be less effective in a different national context. And I think it also brings home what we've been seeing, really. I said this at the Sabre Awards in Mumbai earlier this year. I mean, the quality of work, of public relations work that we have seen coming out of India this year has just been just a huge leap. And we saw that again at the Sabre Awards Asia Pacific on Thursday night. I think India won more awards than any other country, which is the first time that's ever happened.
Well done, you guys.
Well done. And indeed, at the Global Sabre Awards, I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you this, but I'll tell you it anyway. I think at least 3 Indian campaigns have won Global Sabre Awards. Yep, so that's one over there. Archana's the Savlon campaign, I think Medela, and I think Mirinda as well, which is the highest number, again, for India out of the top 40 campaigns that we see across the world, which is selected from, I think 2,500 or something crazy like that. So I think India's, I hope it's a tipping point. It's definitely a moment in terms of the creativity we're seeing in the work. And I wanted to show you this campaign, which is the Mirinda Release the Pressure video.
Exam pressure is one of the leading causes of depression and suicidal tendencies in India. 1 month before the start of national exams, Mirinda released an open letter to parents. For the first time, students talked openly about their feelings, fears, and anxiety. They asked parents to release the pressure. How could we transform awareness into action? Showing parents everywhere we understand the pressures they face, and we have partners and resources that can help. We hosted live chats with child development experts who guided parents through the process of helping students prepare without the pressure. We used the open letters to challenge editors and bloggers to share their own in-depth look at the issue. We worked with Zuni Chopra, a young influential author who recently took her board exams to share her own experience. We even partnered with popular musicians to echo our message in their latest song. In the end, over 24 million people watched the open letters from students. The nation's leading outlets and online sites took our challenge to help parents and students everywhere. And nearly 1.6 million parents made a pledge to release the pressure.
Yeah, so I just thought, you know, the thing I think all of these campaigns have in common is the value of, come back to you and start this discussion off by, you know, very simply, how do you get to that point where you're able to find the right local insight that is then going to inspire the kind of work we've just seen?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is, obviously you have to have a great local team. And I think the challenge with multinational agencies and also multinational companies is to trust the local team, right? And to really bring up that local talent so that they can really tap into the zeitgeist and tap into local culture. I think the other thing that, you know, I'm based in Shanghai, and what we've done over the last 2 or 3 years is really create products and services where nothing exists in the market. So for example, right, obviously in China, social commerce is a really big deal, right? Almost everybody does it. I think people spend 30 minutes per day on e-commerce in every major city in China, right? So we have a whole e-commerce practice, right? Which allows us to deliver creative campaigns across whole new platforms. So it's about the idea and insight, but I think particularly in markets like China, platform is also key as well, right? So we actually create new things where nothing exists. And we have this thing called C3, which is content community commerce. And so we used to do social media campaigns that were really interesting content, right? And build up the community. But then what's the next step for that? So we're actually launching that out of the US. So that's an Asian innovation that was started in China that will be launched in the US coming up very soon, right? So I really believe quite powerfully now that we're right at the cusp of leading. And especially I get excited about India and China because if you look at the mid-2020s, 2025, those two middle-class markets will rule the world basically, right? And you think about all the innovation that's available there. So in some ways, there's no pathway forward anymore. There's no listening to the US marketing textbook. There's creating new things that make sense for these markets. And hopefully those markets going forward will inspire other markets going forward. And I think that's already happening to a degree. And I always use the IPL as an example. I'm Australian. I love cricket. I guess there's probably some cricket fans here. But the IPL has transformed the way cricket is played in every country around the world. We have a thing in Australia called the Big Bash, which was rubbish until the IPL. The IPL showed that with investment, with creativity, pizzazz, and more international and global players, you can really turn a T20 into an amazing value creator. Value creator for people, for entertainment, value for the sponsors, and of course value to the people who own the league. But that has transformed into Australia. The Big Bash League is now totally different now, international players, and they've copied the IPL format. So it's a great example of Indian innovation being exported into the world.
Yeah, I think it's clear that, you know, India and China, we have to get to a point where they're exporting innovation and exporting creativity. And it's great to hear that's happening. Margaret, what are your views here in terms of how you're helping those local insights come to light? Are there any specific issues you're seeing in terms of, for example, talent and the kind of skills that you're looking to develop?
Well, I think, you know, you've said it, coming from an international agency and a global network, a lot of the times when you're coming with the brief, and it's about creating a global campaign, the insight, the ideation resonates from someplace outside of Asia. And every one of the local markets are then, they get on a conference call, and here's the insight, guys. Anybody has any questions? Everybody's like silent. And then you're asked to execute. And the problem is that there's never been, somebody used the word ballsy, I think, before. There hasn't been enough gumption or confidence of us as communicators to push back. Because, as we all know, India operates very different from China. China operates different from Korea. Korea operates differently from Japan. So the local insight is critically important. I'll give you a good example. I do a lot of work with healthcare. And there was a breast cancer campaign, same thing. PowerPoint comes through, here's the insight, here's the execution, and here are the KPIs. Make sure that you do this, here's a budget, blah, 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 blah. The insight in Malaysia, interestingly, is people don't want to talk about breast cancer. More importantly, a husband who has a wife suffering from breast cancer does not want to talk about it at all because there's a taboo to it. So, how do you then take this global campaign and this insight and really make it relevant to a market when it's not going to be relevant at all? So I think, the point of this discussion, I thought 45 minutes would be very long, but I could sit here all day long because it is so important to what we do. I think there needs to be, number one, is pushback. There needs to be a strong confidence in what you can do and understanding about the markets. And basically, when we're talking about creativity and appreciation for what we can as communicators do, you have to be willing to step up, to be ballsy and to be bold. I think that's critically important.
Mm-hmm. If you stayed here all day, you'd melt.
I was going to say, I'm very hot.
Other than that,
I'm very hot.
So, the advice is to push back, particularly against these...
Thank you.
Thank you. Particularly against these, sometimes these global edicts, these global mandates. But what's your advice to someone who is working, in a local market, in a local office, maybe on a multi-market brand or a global brand, and they're being told to execute a campaign? Because it requires courage. It's not always something that's the easiest thing to do, to come back with a different idea, or maybe even to ignore head office.
Can I just say, I do not think Indians have a problem with being courageous. I think if there's one market that I have really respected with opinions and ideation, it's definitely India. So I would say keep going with it. I think to another point too is, I say this as well, yes. Another thing is that the advertising agencies, by the way, because Cannes is supposed to be the nirvana of where we're supposed to be, right? I would say that everybody here in communications, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was never discussion about Cannes at all. Now it's on everybody. Everybody's talking about Cannes. And advertising agencies have always had a greater presence at any of these award shows because they're pushed, when they're an AE, a junior level, your nirvana is to get your work at Cannes. They're told that from day one, okay? So I think for all of us in this room, and I'm just making the assumption that all of us are senior leaders wherever we sit, whether it's in-house or with our agencies, it's the onus on us to do the same thing. Your job every day is to not think about media relations or stakeholder relations or campaigns or client work. Go for the nirvana. You got great ideas. Be bold about it, push forward, and you should be thinking about having your work at Cannes. I think if we started there, we would see a lot of change in how we are seen as creative, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Sorry, I'm getting on the soapbox right now.
But I think also, in some ways, people listen to you once you have success, right? And if you just push back blindly without having any sort of background or pathway of success previously, people won't listen. That happened in our organization, to be honest. I noticed a shift in the last kind of 2 or 3 years where the global guys would come out to Asia and come to China and show all their work. And say, look what we're doing in New York, isn't it great? Chicago's amazing. Then I said to them one year, why don't we show you some of the things we're doing that I think is different to what you do? Your creative craft might be better, but the results we're getting here are much stronger. And so I got my team to start showing them some work, right? And they looked at the success of what was happening with that work, and as I said before, we're taking that inspiration now outside of China into the rest of the world. And so we have, right now in the world, we have these great sources of innovation all around the world, whether they're in Mumbai, Delhi, Beijing, Shanghai, right? Our friends in Stockholm who do amazing work. I do have, I told Arun this yesterday, I really appreciate the Nordic stuff, right? I have envy, Nordic envy, I would say, because I think they do some really creative work as well. And then, of course, there's traditional places like London and New York. So there's so many sources of inspiration now, and I think that's really exciting as well.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the kind of people that are required to deliver or develop this kind of work, because the previous session I moderated was very heavily focused on talent on the corporate communication side. Now, we've seen a lot of the bigger PR agencies hiring in a lot of creatives from the advertising industry with varying levels of success. And that may not be an option that's open to all types of agencies, especially if they're not that big. So is it really that simple? Is it just about bringing in planners and creatives from advertising?
I mean, somebody mentioned earlier, culture beats everything. If you don't have a culture of creativity and innovation in your organization, it doesn't matter who you hire. You can't bring in some hotshot from an advertising agency and they're going to transform your business. It won't work. Unless you are pushing that envelope every day with your work, you have a culture of safety and testing and learning, and you have the clients, by the way, who inspire your agency to do better. Because guys, clients are also important here. Let's not forget it, right? So as a client, how are you inspiring and motivating your agency to do great work? Because if we come to you with creative ideas, new innovation, if you hit the agency on the head every time, that's not going to help. So I think it's having a culture that's safe to test and learn. Because to be honest, these days, if you're not trying new stuff, you're dead. And I think the presentation before really highlighted that very well, right? Consumers resonate with new stuff and new platforms and pushing the envelope forward. And if you're not doing that as an organization, it's really a problem.
Well, I was just going to say, again, I think, so I've seen this as well. I think as PR professionals, when we think about creative, we automatically assume that we're supposed to sit in the back. Really, right? And the reality is, if you've ever been at a table and the client's sitting in the middle and you got your advertising folks, you got data, you got a strategy planner, whatever, at the end of the day, there is one function that knows storytelling better than anybody at that table, and it would be us. Whether it's advertising or marketing or digital social, it's storytelling. That's what we do. The problem is nowadays is the storytelling of yesterday is very different from what it is today. And unless we understand to take off the old clothes and put on the new jackets of we are integrated, so we need to understand advertising, we need to understand the analytics, and we need to take pride in the storytelling piece. I think that's when it's going to come to life. And that's why I say this is the moment. I think of any time that I've been half of my life living in Asia, half of my life working in agencies, we keep thinking about, and it's been a couple of times with you guys at Holmes, I've talked about, is PR viable? Is it relevant? I think if there's any time, it's now. And if there's any time for us to really embrace creativity, it is right now. So we've got to stop shying away. And we've got to be willing to step up to the plate. And I think once we do, clients start to see PR in a different frame. It all sits together.
Let's talk a little bit more about clients, because I think one of the things people will say is, yeah, we had this great idea, but it was too risky for the client. Now, obviously, the clients might have a different point of view, and if you do, you'll have plenty of time to present that shortly when we open to the floor. But Darren, tell me what's your advice for people facing that kind of situation?
So I think we've talked about how important creativity is, but what's also very important is the evolving role of the client leader, the one who really engages with the client day to day. They really have to understand the client back and front.
So the account person.
Right, the account person. And it's no longer a relationship person. It must be a producer of integrated work. And that person's role is evolving very, very rapidly, right? So become a producer, a business consultant, and they work with the creative team or the planners together in a dynamic environment, right? It's not where you have a very segregated, like an advertising agency, very segregated planning function, creative. It's actually merged together in a swarm type function, right? I think it's very important. And so the job of that client leader needs to be to understand the risk profile of the client. We all know that. At the end of the day, clients pay our bills, right? But we need to understand how far they're willing to go on something. And to be honest, behind closed doors, we should always be proposing new ideas, even if they don't get used, right? But the client can see, okay, here's how it might work. Let's try something smaller first, if it's something that we're not used to, and then really understanding the client risk profile. But clients always should be testing and learning now. And we've had even one of the biggest, I would say, most conservative companies in the world in China is a US company, an oil and gas company. I won't name them because we're not allowed to, apparently. But they are super conservative normally in communication. And over the last 5 years, we've been trialing new stuff with them in China on social and commerce, and they've actually taken it on board because they felt comfortable going into it after these tests were taken. They're testing all the time on new stuff.
So I'm just trying to think who it is, but anyway.
I'll tell you the slogan and you'll get no.
Yeah. I think I know.
I'm sorry. It's so hot.
Yeah, I know. I think they have turned the air conditioning on.
I would say, the other thing too, and for all of us too on the agency side, you're looking for that moment when the client is not flipping through pages, looks up and says, and starts asking questions. I have never failed in the moment of doing that when there's research. And we all now have so much, whether it's analytics, digital, social, you can show that to the client, and I think that is, I mean, yes, you need to understand the profile of the client, but I also think that we don't leverage analytics or data enough. And every client, when they see there's justification to the idea, because it's backed by research, they're much more open to doing so. And I think in some parts we fail to do that because we assume that we understand the client, or we understand the market, or we understand the stakeholders. But we have so much information available now because of technology. If we are not leveraging it appropriately, that's when we'll fail as well.
I think Fred mentioned this morning at lunchtime, right, about he said PR agencies should have more B word. I'm not going to use that word because I'm not sure if it's appropriate to use it. But anyway, thanks, Fred. But he said we should push back more. I think PR people are too nice. Honestly, I think that's really right. Like when we do integrated work with other agencies, there might be the creative agent, so-called creative agency, there's the PR shop, there's the media buy, and we kind of swim in our lane. But these other guys are going after our business big time, right? And I think we have to have more strength, right, and really go for that stuff and be more aggressive in what we do. And going back to the kind of Bell Pottinger thing, right? And I think you mentioned this during the Sabre Awards, Arun, which I thought was fantastic. The Sabre Award, the Best in Show this year was a campaign in Sri Lanka that stood up for human rights. And I think those cases you showed, Margaret, as well, it shows the power of what we do, the positive power we do. And I think we don't do enough to talk about what we do externally to attract people towards us. And I think that's a really big issue. We need to be more aggressive in telling the positive stuff we do, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think if the shorthand for the PR industry is Bell Pottinger, then that's a really big problem. We all know that there's so much amazing work that public relations people do that drive really positive change. And I don't think the industry has done a very good job of telling that story.
We need our own PR, right?
Well, exactly. And I would say the other piece of it, too, is whenever I have been called in as part of a WPP group, right? And you've got all your advertising agencies and you've got the PR agencies, and the client has not typically used PR. They've been very heavily reliant on paid and advertising and what have you. We usually come into the fold because of two things. Does anybody have any idea?
Oh, wow.
Crisis.
Oh, yeah.
Crisis. All the time. And it's because nobody
We need
knows.
a press release.
Nobody knows what to do. Yeah, crisis. The second piece is CSR. Things related to purpose. Things related to sustenance of a brand. Today and tomorrow. And again, I think that's the reason why I really want to kind of push this message of we need to take pride in what we do and what we represent. I think we constantly think like we're old school, we're not part of the table. Well, we've got to, as you said, push the envelope on really pushing PR.
We don't think that way.
Yeah, exactly, right. But if there's any group, I mean, particularly here in India and having been part of in the benefit of this conference is you got a huge base of professional communicators. And if there's like China is another example, if we don't use these big markets in Asia to kind of do the soapbox like we have a voice, then we fail to really talk about creative in Asia. It really won't matter unless we really kind of lasso the power of what we do.
Okay.
What we can do.
All right, we have some time for questions from the floor, so please don't be shy. We have Nitin here.
Thank you, Arun. A quick question. Creativity, we've seen creativity grow in India and other markets, seen a lot of campaigns. Even at Cannes, though, 9 out of 10 campaigns but won were cause-related or cause-driven. So is
Cause-related.
Is creativity, are we limiting it to cause-driven?
So I'll just say one couple of things on this, because we just ran a big story on that looked at this exact issue. And it seems, if you look at the way juries work, I think they like to reward work that makes them feel good about themselves. You rarely see tobacco campaigns winning. And I think that phenomenon is writ large at Cannes. And that the risk, of course, which I think maybe is underlying your question, is that cause marketing becomes a tactic to win awards. rather than actually
Correct.
deliver change. But any thoughts from you guys?
Award candy. That's
Yeah.
why I intentionally showed the campaigns that I showed were actually business-driven campaigns, right? Because I think you're totally right. You sit around on a jury and people think they argue about this campaign, and often they're not sure what it really did anyway. It was a great PR thing, but did it really make any impact? Was there any follow-up to it? Not, but it makes them feel better about themselves. So I think our role is to really drive the work forward. And I think you did see this year at Cannes some campaigns in the PR category, which basically were won by non-PR firms, right? Okay. I did see some business transformation stuff there, not just only cause-related marketing.
Okay, thank you.
This is Xavier here. I just have two questions in one. The first is that a lot of these work that you see in awards and all of that are largely for very large brands. The Samsung, the Nike, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Why that? And I think we don't see so much work about smaller brands, which is what I think really Glory is all about. You punch above your weight and you do something really great about. That's the first question. The second question is, also you see a lot of B2C work. All of these are consumer-facing brands which have millions of consumers. There is visibility and all of that. There is a natural momentum. Where are we seeing those tougher B2B? So there are two questions, right? What happened to smaller brands? The second is B2B.
Yeah. I mean, I think for small brands, they just don't enter as much as the big brands. I think that's why, certainly in terms of awards, that's why you don't.
Yeah, the jury seem to actually be inclined, like it is cost-related. They seem to be wired towards bigger brands automatically. Is that really true?
Yeah.
I also think, when you think about Cannes and you think about advertising, again, it's all about the big budgets as well. It's all about, like, what can we do with the scale and the budget? And I think a lot of the smaller companies are not necessarily thinking that basically one idea costs nothing. One good idea is absolutely is nothing. You don't have to pay for it. And I think it's just a lot of small companies, when we're thinking about entering, is like, can we really do we have a chance against these larger companies?
Also, I tend to think language is a problem too. Like in countries like China, for example, people don't really go to the effort of putting in award entries in English. It's quite difficult. And there's interesting work that comes out of Thailand and smaller markets you see, but it's really an effort to get it into really a presentable form. But I think there is some good work. And I think if you look at what's happening in some of those smaller campaigns from Sweden, even this year from Korea, I mean, really interesting work. And I think as a communicator, we have to delve into that and look more outside the mainstream. But I think what happens on the edges often is the more interesting work, and that becomes mainstream. So always looking out for that, the emerging kind of stuff.
Yeah, and as for B2B, I actually think Cannes doesn't really recognize B2B work, which is not like a knock on Cannes, because their focus has always been on consumer work. I think if you look at other shows, whether it's the Sabres or other award shows, they all have B2B categories, and you'll see a lot of good B2B work. Yeah. You really will. And a lot of it is very digital now, very focused on driving sales.
Yes.
And in its own way, highly creative.
Yeah, it's using creativity to be effective sales drivers on the B2B side, I'd say, rather than just creative consumer campaigns.
Correct.
The next question I am raising is about measurement. The AMEC has discredited the use of AVEs as a measure.
Yeah.
And even in the example that you showed about the Cannes winner, there was a slide showing total PR value. I want to know what is the position of the Holmes Report and for Sabre Awards and the Cannes. How far are you in accepting that AVs should not be counted as a measure of a campaign?
Yeah, sure. So we have incorporated the AMEC guidelines now into our judging process. And we've always been really clear that we won't discriminate against entries based on at the point of entry, if that's what you're asking. So anyone can enter the Sabre Awards, for example. But our research and the decisions made by the judges in the Sabre Awards are quite clear in that the award winners are never solely based on a metric like AVE. They always demonstrate some sort of behavioral change or some sort of engagement change.
Okay, thank you.
There's one question there.
My question is, shouldn't awards be an outcome of great work, and great work not be designed in search of an award? Because I think if we design our thinking and limit ourselves to saying, okay, we're going to set our eyes and sights on a certain type or format of award, we're actually limiting the brands and the work we do to aim for that and not essentially tackle what the root cause or the problem is that we're trying to solve if you're talking about social change and actually creating an impact.
We basically just, my belief in creativity is that we use creativity to solve client problems, and that if that leads to an award, then great. But we don't look at things and go, let's make an award out of this. We never do that. And I think you mentioned earlier about advertising, and they do that. They think from the beginning, how do I win an award for this? I think we're changing a little bit, to be honest. I think some people look at it now, and because we've hired so many creative directors, for them it's quite important to win awards, right? That's their kind of portfolio as well, which you've got to respect. But I think if we're solving a problem and really the old way of advertising is using awareness to create value, so buying awareness. If we're creating value, that creates its own awareness, and that's the earned media idea, and that's what we're going towards. So like in India, I think, I also have envy of India because I saw these great award campaigns that actually really affect change, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so Daughters of Mother India, a campaign that Weber Shandwick did a couple of years ago. I was lucky to spend at Cannes some time with a filmmaker. I don't know if you've seen Daughters of Mother India, the video. It's really a great campaign around really understanding women's rights in India and the things that they face. And so that really affects change in certain areas, right? And I think as long as we're making change, and as long as we're transforming, and that work is transformative, we're making change, I think we're good. Awards or not, sorry Arun, maybe that doesn't sound very good, but you know what I mean? We have to solve problems for clients, then we win awards, right?
No, awards are just, a way to celebrate work. The work has to stand on its own 2 feet.
And my earlier comment on advertising, having that entrenched from the very beginning, is not to say that we need to have the same thing in place, but it's really about us being sure and confident about what we do, whether it's a client work or a campaign, is to do more in promoting that. We don't do enough of it. There's fantastic work. I've been a judge of Sabre Awards before. There's fantastic work being done, and I think if we amplify that, there's going to be a greater appreciation of what we do, what we can bring to the table.
I just wanted to share with you a problem that we are facing and to see if you have any ideas on how we can tackle this. So we're an independent agency, communications. We have a big multinational client in the healthcare beauty space. We went to them with an idea that has global legs, but is actually to be launched in the Middle East, which is where we are based. And part of the idea, a very creative idea, which the client loved and bought into, but has now proceeded to take apart and take the creative elements out of it and give it to their standard advertising agency to now execute. So we are having to do the communications launch of this concept
your own idea.
With our own idea, which is now being the creative part of it is now being created by the advertising agency. So it's not actually in the frame that we had presented it. How do we fight our piece back? Because this is what's happening.
Do you know why that happened? Was that because they have these kind of clear swim lanes and they thought you were like intruding on someone else's swim lane? Yeah. That's hard.
And they're allowing that to happen.
It sounds like a great client, by the way.
Kudos to you to get that idea there, right? Yeah.
I think it's a client that hasn't really understood the role and value of PR. Yeah. So it's relatively new for them to understand that.
Or maybe they don't have the confidence you can actually execute the idea.
Possibly.
I think that's a challenge we have sometimes, that people, if they're old school marketers, will say, you're a PR firm. If we don't know who we are, they say, oh, PR, you can't execute that big idea. But then the only way we can do it, as I said earlier, is by showing them we can do it by doing work. The only way you can convince somebody is by actually doing it versus talking about doing it. And we do a lot of things where my big thing in China is fake it until you make it. So we actually sell things that we probably haven't done before, but we know we can do. And by doing that stuff, and it works really well, and getting recognition, that we can do more of it. But I think it's the only way. And it's frustrating when that happens. I've been there. I know, yeah. It really sucks.
Yeah, I've seen many a time, but this is again where you have clients who just don't see us doing that. And the more that we do, and the more that it's attributed to us, is the only way that it's going to change.
Of course, no clients here think that way, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, if you could join me in thanking Darren and Margaret for a very stimulating conversation on creativity.
Thank you all.